ever wondered if being single in the olden days was all doom and gloom? Did ancient societies really try to fine people for not getting hitched? Were there guidebooks for ladies on how to snag a husband that sound utterly bonkers today? And could a queen stay single and still be one of the most powerful rulers ever? Get ready to peek into the past, where single life was sometimes strange, often challenging, but occasionally and quite unintentionally hilarious. Number 10. Medieval spinsters and the Great Wool Kerfuffle. Picture the Middle Ages. Knights, castles, and spinsters. The word itself, spinster, originally just meant a woman who spins wool or thread. It was a perfectly respectable job, and a vital one. Wool was a massive industry. Like oil or tech is today, England's economy, for example, heavily relied on wool exports, so women who could spin were essential. Many unmarried women, or women whose husbands were away or had passed, supported themselves this way. They were independent craftswomen, contributing members of their communities. But over time, things got a bit complicated for the spinster. If a woman remained unmarried past a certain age, the term started to take on a different flavor. It wasn't just a job description anymore. It became a label. Society back then had pretty rigid ideas about where everyone fit. For women, that usually meant being a wife and mother. So, a woman who was just a spinster, especially as she got older, started to become a bit of an outlier, someone people weren't quite sure what to do with. The humorous, or perhaps more accurately absurd part, comes in how society sometimes viewed these women. On one hand, they were doing crucial work. Spinning was often done in groups, a social activity as much as an economic one. Imagine a room full of women fibers flying, spindles twirling, and surely a lot of chatter. They had their own networks, their own skills, and a degree of economic independence that was not always common for women. Some spinsters even became quite prosperous through their craft, managing their own small businesses. They could own property, make contracts, and even take people to court if they needed to. They were not necessarily sitting by the fire, sadly sighing. Yet on the other hand, because they were not married, they could be seen as a bit unusual. There were superstitions and stereotypes. If a woman was unmarried, particularly if she was older and lived alone, she might be viewed with suspicion. This was a time when people believed in all sorts of things, and anything outside the norm could be a target for gossip or mistrust. Think about the later witch trials. Older, single women were disproportionately accused. While not all spinsters were accused of witchcraft by any means, the underlying societal discomfort with women who did not fit the wifely mold could lead to some strange perceptions. Literature and popular tales from the period and later sometimes portrayed the old maid or spinster in a less than flattering light. She might be depicted as cantankerous, gossipy, or pitiable. This is where the unintentional humor arises for us today. The idea that a woman who was likely a skilled artisan and economically active could be reduced to a caricature simply because she did not have a husband. Consider the sheer amount of wool these women processed. It was a constant, demanding job. They were not idle. They were turning raw fleece into the thread that would become clothes, tapestries, sails for ships. They were, in a very real sense, weaving the fabric of medieval society. Yet, if they did not marry, their primary identity in the eyes of some could shift from skilled wool producer to unmarried woman with all the social baggage that might entail. There were also practical considerations. Without a husband or adult sons, an older spinster might face fambroides. Legal systems were often geared towards households headed by men. However, communities also had ways of supporting their members, and many spinsters lived within extended family networks or formed strong bonds with other women. The kerfuffle, then, is this strange mix of vital economic contribution and slightly awkward social status. They were everywhere. They were essential. But they were also a bit of a question mark in a society that liked clear answers and traditional family units. The image of a medieval woman, fiercely independent with her spindle, expertly producing thread that clothed the nation, while simultaneously being subject to pitying glances or silly stereotypes because she was not married, is a curious snapshot of history. No dramatic taxation on just being a spinster typically, but the social pressures and the sometimes comical, sometimes frustrating stereotypes were definitely a thing. They were working hard, minding their own business and contributing massively, yet the simple fact of their marital status could generate a whole lot of societal head-scratching and eyebrow-raising. Number 9. Ancient Rome's bachelor tax, or how Caesar Augustus tried to make everyone marry. Imagine living in ancient Rome, the mighty empire, and the emperor himself starts getting really interested in your love life or lack thereof. This is pretty much what happened under Emperor Augustus around 18, before Common Era and 9 Common Era. Augustus was a man on a mission. He had ended decades of civil war, brought peace, the Pax Romana, and was keen on restoring what he saw as traditional Roman virtues, and importantly boosting the population of the Roman upper classes. He looked around and apparently thought, there are too many single people, especially well-off ones, not doing their bit for Rome. So he introduced a series of laws known as the Julian laws on marriage and the Lex Papia Poppaea. These laws were not subtle. They were designed to encourage marriage and childbirth, especially among the senatorial and equestrian orders, the elite of Roman society. If you were a man of a certain age, say between 25 and 60, and you were unmarried, well, Augustus had some news for you. You could face penalties. One of the most talked about aspects was the inability to inherit property fully if you were childless or unmarried. If someone left you a fortune in their will, you might only get a portion of it, or none at all, if you did not meet the marriage and children criteria. The state could end up with the rest. Ouch! Women were not entirely off the hook either. Unmarried women between 20 and 50 faced similar restrictions on inheritances. Widows were given a certain amount of time to remarry, and if they did not, they too could face penalties. The laws also favored those who had children. The more children you had, the more advantages you received. Having 3 children if you were freeborn, or 4 if you were a freed person, brought special privileges, like preference in political careers for men, and more freedom from male guardianship for women. This was known as the ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children. The reaction to these laws was, as you might expect, mixed. Some probably thought it was a great idea, very patriotic. Others, particularly those directly affected, were likely grumbling quite a bit. Roman poets of the time like Ovid and Propertius wrote about love and relationships in ways that sometimes seemed to poke fun at or subtly resist these official pressures. Their poetry often celebrated romantic love and personal choice, which did not always align neatly with the state's agenda of dutiful marriage for procreation. Imagine the awkward conversations. So Gaius still single, you know that inheritance from your uncle Marcus might just disappear. Or Julia, lovely to see you. Any marriage prospects? Time is ticking, you know, for that legacy from Aunt Livia. It adds a whole new layer of pressure to dating. There were, of course, ways people tried to get around these laws. There were probably some marriages of convenience, or people desperately trying to find a spouse before a legal deadline. One can only imagine the Roman equivalent of frantic swiping on a dating app, but with much higher stakes. The laws even specified things like who senators could and could not marry. They were generally barred from marrying freed women or actresses, for instance, further complicating the marriage market for the elite. What's genuinely amusing from our modern perspective is the idea of the government being so deeply invested in people's marital status that it would use financial penalties and rewards on such a personal level. Augustus wanted more little Roman aristocrats running around, and he was willing to legislate for it. He saw a decline in birth rates among the upper classes and a perceived decline in morality, and these laws were his rather direct solution. Did it work? Historians debate the long-term effectiveness of these laws. They were certainly enforced, and they did cause a stir. They were modified over time by later emperors, but the core idea of using the law to encourage marriage and procreation persisted for a while. For the bachelors and unattached women of Augustan Rome, though it must have felt like Big Brother, or perhaps Big Emperor, was watching their every romantic or non-romantic move. The idea of the state essentially saying pair up or pay up has a distinctly you cannot be serious quality when viewed through 21st century eyes. Makes today's dating woes seem a little less taxing, perhaps literally. Number 8. The Victorian surplus woman and her amazing bicycle escape. The Victorian era in Britain, roughly from the 1830s to 1901, was a time of immense change, industrial revolution, empire building, and very particular ideas about men and women. For women, the ideal was often to be the angel in the house, a devoted wife and mother, managing the domestic sphere. But there was a problem, a demographic quirk that caused a lot of head-scratching and hand-wringing. There were more women than men, especially in the middle and upper classes. This led to the rather unfortunate term surplus women, or redundant women. Census figures showed it. For a variety of reasons, including men emigrating to the colonies, higher male infant mortality, and men marrying later in life, many women simply did not have the mathematical possibility of finding a husband within their social class. This was a big deal in a society where a woman's economic security and social standing were often tied to her husband. What were these surplus women to do? The societal response was a mix of pity, concern, and a whole lot of unsolicited advice. Magazines and conduct books were full of it. Some advice was practical, suggesting women train for respectable professions like teaching or nursing, which were becoming more open to them, albeit often poorly paid. Governessing was a common, if often lonely, and difficult path. Other advice was more, well, peculiar. There were suggestions for charitable work, intense religious devotion, or dedicating oneself to the care of relatives. The underlying message was often to find fulfillment in ways that did not involve marriage, but within very prescribed, ladylike boundaries. The humorous aspect, tinged with the absurdity of the situation, comes from the sheer panic and the sometimes bizarre solutions proposed or imagined. There were even debates about encouraging these women to emigrate to the colonies where men supposedly outnumbered women, as if they were goods to be shipped to where demand was higher. Imagine being told your best option in life is to pack up and move to the other side of the world in the hope of finding a husband among strangers. Then into this somewhat stuffy and constrained world for single women rolled the bicycle. The safety bicycle, with its two similarly sized wheels and chain drive, became hugely popular in the 1890s, and for women, it was more than just a newfangled contraption. It was a vehicle of liberation. Suddenly, a woman could travel independently without needing a chaperone or a carriage. She could go further, faster, and explore the world on her own terms. This, of course, caused a bit of a moral panic. Doctors warned that bicycling was unfeminine, that it could harm a woman's delicate constitution or even heaven forbid, make her too independent or mannish. There were concerns about the bicycle face, a supposed strained, flushed expression women might get from riding. Special, more modest cycling costumes were designed, though some daring women started wearing bloomers or divided skirts which were scandalous in themselves. But women embraced the bicycle with enthusiasm. For the so-called surplus woman, it offered a taste of freedom and mobility that was previously unimaginable. It was a way to escape, literally and figuratively, some of the constraints of her life. She could meet friends, explore the countryside, get exercise, and simply enjoy the thrill of movement. It also became associated with the New Woman movement, which advocated for greater educational and professional opportunities for women and challenged traditional gender roles. The image of a Victorian lady, perhaps deemed surplus by society, gleefully pedaling away on her bicycle, bloomers flapping, leading a cloud of dust and societal expectations behind her, is wonderfully anachronistic and empowering. The bicycle did not solve the demographic imbalance or instantly grant women full equality, but it gave many single women a new sense of agency and a joyful, healthy outlet. Contrast between the stuffy drawing rooms where their surplus status was lamented and the open road they could now access on two wheels is quite striking. It was a small revolution, powered by pedals, and it must have been a wonderfully liberating experience for those women, regardless of what the worried commentators thought about their bicycle face or their moral fortitude. Number 7. The 18th century, confirmed bachelor, a creature of mystery and drapes. Step into the 18th century, the age of enlightenment, powdered wigs, and elaborate manners. In this society, marriage was still very much the norm and the expected path for most. However, there existed a figure that both intrigued and slightly perplexed people: the confirmed bachelor. This was not just any single man. This was a man, often of some means and social standing, who seemed to have made a deliberate choice to remain unmarried. Unlike the old maid, who was often pitied or caricatured, the confirmed bachelor could cultivate an air of sophisticated independence or sometimes eccentricity. He might be a man of letters, a dedicated scholar, a passionate collector of art or antiquities, or simply someone who enjoyed his freedom and his own company, or the company of other like-minded men. Because he was not channeling his resources into raising a family, he might have more disposable income for his hobbies, his wardrobe, or creating a very particular living space. The humorous aspect from our modern viewpoint often lies in the elaborate performances of identity and the sometimes over-the-top stereotypes associated with these men. Think of characters in literature from around this period or inspired by it. The bachelor's apartment might be described as meticulously carooted, perhaps a bit overly fussy, filled with curious objects, books, and art. He might be very particular about his food, his wine, his snuff, or the cut of his coat. He was, in a way, creating a life that was an alternative to the domesticity of marriage. And sometimes this alternative could look quite theatrical. There was often a certain mystique around the confirmed bachelor. Why had he chosen this path? Was it a lost love? A dedication to a higher intellectual calling? A simple aversion to the perceived drudgery or expense of family life? Perhaps reasons that society at the time did not openly discuss or acknowledge, such as a preference for male companionship that went beyond simple friendship. The 18th and 19th centuries had very different understandings and expressions of same-sex attraction compared to today, and the confirmed bachelor status could sometimes provide a socially acceptable space for men who were not inclined to marry women, without necessarily labeling their reasons. Consider the social life of such a man. He might be a sought-after dinner guest, witty and urbane. He might host gatherings in his own well-appointed rooms, presiding over conversations about art, philosophy, or politics. He could also be seen as a bit of a safe companion for married women, not a threat to their husbands. Or he might be viewed as slightly selfish, shirking his societal duty to marry and produce heirs. It really depended on the individual and how he presented himself. The drapes in the headline hint at the attention to domestic detail that sometimes characterized the bachelor's abode. While a married man's home was often the domain of his wife, the bachelor had sole control over his environment. This could lead to highly personalized, sometimes quirky, living spaces. Imagine rooms filled with exotic souvenirs from a grand tour, shelves overflowing with books, scientific instruments, or perhaps a collection of porcelain teacups that he was very particular about. This attention to the aesthetics of his life could be seen as refined, or perhaps a little too self-absorbed. Satirists of the time sometimes poked fun at the figure of the aging bachelor, portraying him as set in his ways, overly concerned with his own comfort, or perhaps a bit lonely despite his cultivated independence. There was an ambiguity to him. Was he a figure of freedom and intellectual pursuit, or a slightly sad, self-indulgent character who had missed out on the true joys of family? What is fascinating is how this confirmed bachelor status allowed for a different kind of male life, one that was not defined by the roles of husband and father. It was a niche, perhaps, but a recognized one. The mystery, the specific lifestyle choices, the often meticulous attention to personal comfort and aesthetics, these are the elements that, when viewed through the lens of historical social norms, can appear quite amusing or at least highly distinctive. He was a man who, for whatever reason, opted out of the main script, and in doing so often wrote a very interesting, if sometimes misunderstood, part for himself. Number 6. Queen Elizabeth I, the ultimate boss, level single, lady power, play. When you think of powerful monarchs, Queen Elizabeth, the first of England, often comes to mind. She reigned for over 44 years, from 1558 to 1603, a period known as the Elizabethan era, famous for Shakespeare, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and England's flourishing as a major European power. And one of the most remarkable things about Elizabeth was that she never married. In an age when queens were generally expected to marry to secure alliances, produce heirs, and provide a king to rule alongside them or for them, Elizabeth turned her single status into one of her greatest political assets. From the moment she ascended the throne at age 25, the question of her marriage was a massive political issue. Her counselors, parliament, and foreign rulers all pressured her to marry. Potential suitors lined up from all over Europe. Philip I of Spain, various French princes like the Duke of Anjou, archdukes from the Holy Roman Empire, Eric Sieve of Sweden, and even some English noblemen like Robert Dudley, her childhood friend. Each potential match came with a complex web of political, religious, and dynastic implications. Marrying a Catholic could upset her Protestant subjects. Marrying a foreigner could risk England becoming a pawn in another country's games. Marrying an Englishman could create jealousy and factionalism among the nobility. Elizabeth played this game with extraordinary skill. For decades, she kept the marriage negotiations going with various parties, using the prospect of her hand as a diplomatic tool. She would encourage one suitor, then another, keeping everyone guessing, keeping them hopeful, and thereby preventing them from forming alliances against England. It was a masterful display of political maneuvering. She famously told Parliament, "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England." And later she cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, married to her country and her people, a powerful symbol of devotion and purity that resonated with many of her subjects. The humorous part, if you can call it that in such high-stakes politics, comes from the sheer length of time she kept this up and the exasperation of her suitors and advisors. Imagine these powerful kings and princes sending envoys, writing letters, offering grand proposals, only to be met with Elizabeth's clever deflections, her coyness, her strategic delays. She would express interest, then find reasons to hesitate. She would demand portraits, ask detailed questions about their character, their health, their finances, all while expertly avoiding any actual commitment. There are countless anecdotes. When the Duke of Anjou, a much younger French prince, was a serious contender, Elizabeth, then in her late 40s, appeared to be genuinely considering it. She even kissed him in public, leading many to believe a match was imminent. Then she pulled back. The negotiations dragged on for years. One can only imagine the diplomatic roller coaster. Her counselors were often tearing their hair out, desperate for her to marry and secure the succession with an heir. But Elizabeth always maintained control. She was also known for her sharp wit. When pressed about marriage, she had ready answers. She once declared, "I will have but one mistress here, and no master." She understood the power dynamics. As a married woman, particularly to a foreign prince, she risked losing some of her authority. By remaining single, she remained unambiguously the ruler of England. Her personal feelings remain a subject of debate. She clearly had deep affection for some, like Robert Dudley, but whether she ever truly desired to marry anyone is uncertain. What is clear is that she premonitized her role as queen and the welfare of her kingdom above all else. Her decision to remain unmarried was not a passive one. It was an active political strategy. The image of this powerful queen, surrounded by men urging her to marry, deftly outmaneuvering them all for decades, using her eligibility as a weapon in international diplomacy, is quite something. It was a high-wire act, and she performed it brilliantly. While her single status caused immense anxiety regarding the succession, she died without a direct heir, and the throne passed to James VI of Scotland during her lifetime. It was a key component of her successful reign. She turned what society saw as a woman's default path, marriage, into a source of unique political strength, baffling and often frustrating some of the most powerful men in Europe in the process. It was a power play of epic proportions, executed by a queen who knew her own mind and her own worth. Number 5. Edo, Japan's floating world and the art of stylish single living. Travel to Japan during the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868. This was a time of relative peace and stability under the Tokugawa shogunate, but also a time of strict social hierarchies and rules. Society was rigidly structured with samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and then merchants at the bottom, though merchants often became very wealthy. For many, life was about duty, obligation, and fitting into one's prescribed role, which usually included marriage and family. However, within this structured society, there emerged vibrant urban cultures, especially in cities like Edo, modern-day Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka. And within these cities, there were specific districts known as ukiyo, or the floating world. The term ukiyo originally had Buddhist connotations of the sorrowful world of transient existence, but during the Edo period, it took on a new meaning. The world of fleeting pleasures, style, and entertainment, a place to escape the rigid constraints of everyday life. The floating world was the playground of the rising merchant class, who had money but lacked the social status of the samurai. It was also frequented by samurai looking for entertainment. Here, one could find kabuki theaters, puppet shows, bunraku, tea houses, restaurants, and the licensed pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara in Edo. And in this world, many of the stars and key figures were, in their professional lives at least, single. Think of the great kabuki actors. These were often men who achieved superstar status, adored by fans. They dedicated their lives to their art, playing both male and female roles with incredible skill. Their lives were often unconventional, centered around the theater, and its demanding schedules. While some married, many lived lives that were very different from the typical family man. Then there were the courtesans of the Yoshiwara and other districts. These were not simply prostitutes. The top-ranking courtesans, known as Oyaran or Taiyu, were highly accomplished women. They were skilled in arts like poetry, calligraphy, flower arranging, playing musical instruments, and the art of conversation. To spend time with a high-ranking courtesan was incredibly expensive and involved elaborate rituals and etiquette. These women were fashion trendsetters, their styles copied by women throughout the city. They were single in the sense of not being married in the conventional way, and they operated within a complex system that gave them a degree of economic agency and cultural influence, albeit within a life that was ultimately unfree and exploitative for many. The depictions of these women in ukiyo woodblock prints by artists like Utamaro often show them as elegant, intelligent, and very much in control of their sophisticated world, even if the reality was more complex. Artists themselves, the creators of those iconic ukiyo, prints like Hokusai and Hiroshiga, often lived lives dedicated to their craft. They captured the vibrancy of the floating world, the actors, the courtesans, the landscapes, the city life. Their focus was on observing and depicting this transient, stylish world, and their own lives were often deeply enmeshed in it. Many were single for long periods, or lived somewhat bohemian lifestyles. What's hilarious, or at least fascinatingly different from a Western perspective of historical single life, is not necessarily laugh-out-loud funny, but rather the societal acceptance and even celebration of these specific forms of non-married life within a particular sphere. The floating world was, in a way, a recognized zone for pleasure, art, and a certain kind of stylish, unattached existence. It was understood that the rules were a bit different there. The art of ukiyo, for instance, did not judge the lifestyles it depicted. It celebrated their beauty, their energy, their fleeting nature. The emphasis was on transience and enjoying the moment, which is a core aspect of the ukiyo philosophy. This could be seen as a form of single-minded dedication, whether to art, performance, or the intricate social dances of the pleasure quarters. It was a world where appearances, wit, and artistic skill could matter more than lineage or traditional family ties. Of course, this floating world was not without its dark side. The lives of many women in the pleasure quarters were difficult and controlled by others, but the cultural products of this world, the plays, the prints, the stories, often focused on the glamour, the romance, and the sophisticated pleasures. They depicted a slice of society where being unattached, or attached in unconventional ways, was part of the allure and the artistry of life. It offers a different lens on historical singlehood, not as a lack or a problem to be solved, but as a particular, albeit specialized, mode of living, wrapped up in art, entertainment, and the pursuit of fleeting beauty. The sheer aesthetic dedication to these lifestyles, as captured in the art, is what stands out as uniquely captivating. Number 4. The Old Maid card game and its not-so-subtle social commentary. Many of us probably played the card game Old Maid as children. It is a simple matching game. You collect pairs of cards, and the player left holding the single unpaired Old Maid card at the end is the loser. It seems like harmless fun. But have you ever stopped to think about the name and the imagery of that central card? The game, which became popular in the Victorian era, carried some pretty heavy, if cartoonish, social baggage. The very premise of the game is built around the idea that being the old maid, an unmarried woman of a certain age, is undesirable. You do not want to be left with that card. The imagery on the Old Maid card itself, across different versions of the game, has often been a caricature. She might be depicted as unattractive, eccentric, perhaps with a stern expression, surrounded by cats, or looking somewhat pitiable. This visual representation reinforced the negative stereotype of the older unmarried woman that was prevalent in society. The game's origins are a bit murky, but it gained widespread popularity in the 19th century, a time, as we have discussed with surplus women, when there was significant societal anxiety about unmarried women. Marriage was considered the primary goal and source of security for women. A woman who did not marry could be seen as having failed in some way, or as an object of pity, or sometimes even ridicule. The old maid card game tapped right into these anxieties and social judgments, packaging them up for children. What is hilariously absurd in a rather dark way is how casually this societal judgment was embedded into a children's pastime. Kids were learning through play that being an old maid was something to avoid, something that made you the loser. It is a striking example of how cultural norms and prejudices can be transmitted in seemingly innocent ways. Imagine the conversations around the game. "Oh no, don't give me the old maid," or "Haha, you're stuck with the old maid." The game essentially gamified a real-life social predicament for many women. In an era with limited professional opportunities for women and strong social pressure to marry, being an unmarried older woman was often genuinely difficult. The game, however, reduced this complex reality to a simple, slightly comical losing condition. There were no confirmed bachelor cards that made you lose, notably. The focus was squarely on the unmarried woman. Different cultures had variations of the game. In France, it was Vieux Garçon, Old Boy Bachelor, and in Germany, Schwarzer Peter, Black Peter, which had its own problematic caricatures. But the English-speaking world largely stuck with the old maid, making it a very gendered form of losing. Consider the contrast. While actual single women might be running households, pursuing careers as writers or artists like Jane Austen, who never married, engaging in social reform, or simply living quiet, respectable lives, the game presented a one-dimensional, often unflattering image. It is a bit like having a modern game where the losing card is person who is bad at social media, or person who still has student loans. It takes a real-life anxiety and turns it into a point of playful mockery. Continued existence and popularity of the game, even as societal views on marriage and singlehood have evolved, is also interesting. Many modern versions have tried to update the imagery to be less stereotypical, or have even changed the losing card to something neutral like a mismatch card or an animal. Classic Old Maid, with her traditional, often caricatured depiction, lingers in cultural memory. It is a small thing, a simple card game, but it speaks volumes about how deeply ingrained certain social attitudes were. The humor, if we can call it that, is in the bluntness of the message and the thought of generations of children absorbing this subtle or not so subtle lesson about the supposed undesirability of being an older, unmarried woman. It is a historical papig that makes you chuckle at its outdatedness, while also wincing a little at the social reality it reflects. Number 3. Ancient Greek philosophers on being single, epic beards, big thoughts, odd choices. Ancient Greece, the cradle of Western philosophy, gave us Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and a host of other thinkers who pondered the big questions of life, the universe, and everything. And yes, some of them had rather strong and occasionally peculiar opinions and lifestyles when it came to love, marriage, and being single. It was not all togas and symposiums about abstract forms. Sometimes it got very personal and a bit weird. Take Diogenes of Sinope, the famous Cynic philosopher who lived in the 4th century before Common Era. Diogenes was the ultimate monistist, and perhaps the ultimate eccentric bachelor by choice. He believed in living a life of virtue in agreement with nature, which for him meant rejecting all conventional desires for wealth, power, fame, and even basic comforts. He famously lived in a large ceramic jar or tub in the marketplace of Athens. He owned almost nothing, begged for a living, and was known for his deliberately shocking and shameless behavior, all designed to critique societal norms and hypocrisy. Marriage and family, not for Diogenes. Such things were conventional trappings that he rejected. His single life was an extreme philosophical statement. Imagine this bearded philosopher, possibly a bit smelly, living in a barrel publicly challenging people like Alexander the Great. When Alexander asked if he could do anything for him, Diogenes supposedly replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." His singleness was part of his radical commitment to self-sufficiency and freedom from societal expectations. Hilarious. Perhaps not to his contemporaries who found him outrageous, but the sheer audacity of his lifestyle choices, a kind of performance art of philosophical singlehood, is certainly striking and has an element of dark comedy. Then there was Plato, a student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle. Plato's views on love and relationships are complex, famously explored in his dialogue, The Symposium. While he discusses different kinds of love, including romantic and physical attraction, his highest ideal is often seen as Platonic love, a love that transcends the physical and aims for an appreciation of beauty itself and the pursuit of wisdom. Plato himself never married and had no children. His life was dedicated to his academy in Athens, a center of learning and philosophical inquiry. While not as theatrically single as Diogenes, his philosophical leanings seem to prioritize the intellectual and spiritual over conventional family life. He envisioned an ideal state in his republic where, for the guardian class, private families and property would be abolished. To ensure their loyalty was only to the state, a rather extreme take on communal living that certainly downplays traditional marriage. Epicurus, another influential Hellenistic philosopher, founded a school of thought known as Epicureanism, often misunderstood as promoting hedonistic indulgence. In reality, Epicurus advocated for a life of simple pleasures, tranquility, patraxia, and freedom from fear and pain. For Epicurus, friendship was incredibly important, perhaps more so than romantic or sexual relationships, which he thought could often lead to turmoil and distress. He lived in a community called the Garden with his friends, both men and women, sharing a simple life. While he did not explicitly forbid marriage, the emphasis on tranquility and avoiding disturbance might have led many Epicureans to favor a single life focused on friendship and philosophical contemplation. The idea of choosing your companions based on shared philosophical goals, rather than romantic or familial obligation, is a distinct take on a fulfilling, unpartnered life. Even Socrates, who was married to Xanthippe, famously portrayed as a shrew, though this might be an unfair caricature, often seemed to value his philosophical discussions with young men in the agora more than his domestic life. His devotion was to the pursuit of truth, often at the expense of more worldly concerns. What is amusing here is the variety and sometimes the extremity of these philosophical positions on single life or alternatives to traditional marriage. From Diogenes' living in a barrel to make a point singlehood, to Plato's intellectualized view of love, to Epicurus' serene garden community of friends, these great thinkers were not just theorizing in a vacuum. Their philosophies often informed their personal life choices, or vice versa. They offer a spectrum of ancient justifications for, or approaches to, not following the standard married path, often rooted in very deep, yet sometimes very quirky intellectual commitments. It shows that questioning the necessity of marriage is not just a modern phenomenon. Some of the most brilliant minds in antiquity were already living and promoting alternative ways of being. Their dedication to their principles, even when it led to lifestyles that would seem bizarre to many, has a certain grandeur and, yes, a touch of the hilariously unconventional. Number 2. Renaissance courtesans, witty, wealthy, and willfully unwed wizards of words. The Renaissance, that dazzling period of artistic and intellectual rebirth in Europe, roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, is often associated with masterpieces of art and literature. But it also saw the rise of a particular kind of single woman, the accomplished and often influential courtesan, especially in Italian cities like Venice and Rome. These were not just women offering companionship for a price. The most successful among them were educated, witty, artistically talented, and remarkably independent for their time. Term courtesan itself, cortigiana in Italian, originally meant a woman of the court. Cortigiana onesta, or honest courtesan, was distinguished from common prostitutes by her intellectual and artistic accomplishments, her refined manners, and her often long-term relationships with powerful and wealthy men, including cardinals, ambassadors, and nobles. These women were by definition unmarried. Marriage would have meant a completely different, and often much more restricted, life. So intriguing, and from a historical distance rather awe-inspiring with a dash of you-go-girl humor, is how these women carved out such unique and influential niches for themselves in a patriarchal society. They were often skilled poets, musicians, and conversationalists. Their salons could be centers of literary and artistic discussion. They had to be incredibly smart and adaptable to navigate the complex social and political landscapes of their cities. Take Veronica Franco, a famous Venetian courtesan of the 16th century. She was a published poet, and her verses were known for their wit, intelligence, and sometimes their frank exploration of female desire and experience. She engaged in literary debates, defended women in her writings, and even proposed the establishment of a home for poor women. She moved in elite circles, and her patrons included some of the most powerful men in Venice. She chose her companions, managed her own finances, often quite successfully, and used her intellect and charm to build a life of considerable autonomy. Imagine a woman in the 1500s, not defined by a husband, but by her own words and wit, holding her own with the leading men of the day. Or consider Tullia d'Aragona, another renowned 16th century Italian courtesan, who was also a poet, writer, and philosopher. She was celebrated for her learning and her literary talents, and her salon in Rome attracted prominent intellectuals and artists. She wrote dialogues on the infinity of love, exploring Neoplatonic ideas. These women were not hiding in the shadows. They were public figures, often admired for their talents, even if their profession was morally ambiguous in the eyes of the church and conservative society. The willfully unwed aspect is key. For these women, remaining single was essential to their profession and their independence. Marriage would have meant subordination to a husband and the loss of their ability to engage with a wide range of men and ideas. Their single status was, in a way, their business model and their ticket to a certain kind of freedom, rarely available to other women. The humor, perhaps, lies in the audacity of it all. In a world with very strict rules for women, especially regarding virtue and marriage, these courtesans created a parallel universe where different rules applied, at least for them. They were often criticized, of course, by moralists. There were sumptuary laws trying to regulate their dress and behavior, but their allure and the power of their patrons often allowed them to thrive. They were in a sense playing the system and winning, using the very tools, beauty, charm, intelligence that society valued in women, but deploying them on their own terms outside the confines of matrimony. They had to be incredibly skilled performers of self. Their wit was a weapon and a shield. Their education was an asset. Their ability to entertain, to challenge, to console, and to inspire made them sought-after companions. They were, in their own way, female entrepreneurs in a highly competitive market, and their product was not just physical intimacy, but a whole package of intellectual stimulation, artistic grace, and sophisticated companionship. The image of a Renaissance courtesan, draped in fine silks, debating philosophy or reciting poetry in a room full of admiring and paying powerful men, while remaining resolutely her own woman, is a testament to an extraordinary kind of historical single life. They were not just single. They were spectacularly, strategically, and often very successfully single. Number 1. The new woman of the early 20th century, cutting hair, casting votes, and causing chaos. Hold on to your hats, because the arrival of the new woman in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was like a social earthquake. This was not your grandmother's idea of a lady, or even your mother's, if you were living around the turn of the century. The new woman was a figure of independence, education, and often a shocking to some embrace of single life, or at least a life not solely defined by marriage and domesticity. She was often depicted in popular culture, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with alarm, as a young woman who was educated, perhaps even college-educated. She might be pursuing a career maybe as a typist, a journalist, a teacher, or even a doctor or lawyer, professions that were slowly, painstakingly opening up to women. She was often politically aware, perhaps involved in the women's suffrage movement, demanding the right to vote and a voice in public life. And yes, she was often single either by choice or because she was delaying marriage to pursue her own goals. The hilarious part, looking back, is the sheer panic and pearl clutching this figure induced in conservative circles and the often comical ways she was stereotyped. She might be shown cutting her hair short into a bob, which was seen as a radical act of defiance against traditional femininity. She might be depicted smoking cigarettes in public, another shocking behavior for a lady. She might be riding a bicycle. That symbol of female emancipation from the 1890s was still going strong. Or even as the 20th century progressed, driving an automobile Gaspé. Magazines and newspapers were full of articles and cartoons about the new woman. Some portrayed her as a positive, energetic force for progress. Others depicted her as mannish, selfish, a threat to the family and the natural order of things. She was accused of abandoning her true womanly duties. The idea that a woman might want a life beyond being a wife and mother, or that she might have intellectual and professional ambitions, was genuinely unsettling to many. Consider the Gibson girl, an iconic image created by American illustrator Charles Dana Gibson around the 1890s and early 1900s. While often elegant and fashionable, the Gibson girl also represented a more active, independent, and self-assured type of young woman. She was often shown engaging in sports, being witty and intelligent, and seemingly in control of her own romantic choices, sometimes appearing rather aloof or amused by her many male admirers. She was an idealized version of the new woman, aspirational and less threatening than some other portrayals, but still a departure from older feminine ideals. Then came the flapper of the 1920s, who was, in many ways, the new woman's more flamboyant younger sister. Flappers took the independence thing and ran with it, with shorter skirts, bobbed hair, jazz music, dancing the Charleston, and an attitude of breezy defiance. They were the embodiment of a new social freedom for young women, often single and working, enjoying their youth and independence in the booming cities. The older generation was frequently scandalized by their behavior, their slang, their perceived lack of morals. The image of a flapper, confidently navigating the urban landscape, perhaps with a hip flask and a string of pearls, is an enduring symbol of a new era of female autonomy. What makes these depictions hilarious today is the stark contrast between the anxieties of the time and our modern, though still evolving, perspectives on women's roles. The things that were considered so shocking, women voting, working outside the home, choosing their own lifestyles, having opinions, are now largely taken for granted, at least in many parts of the world. The media hysteria and the dire predictions about the collapse of society because women wanted more freedom seem wonderfully overblown from our vantage point. These new women were pioneers. They were pushing boundaries and challenging deeply entrenched norms. Their single status was often a key part of this challenge. By choosing not to marry early or by envisioning a life where marriage was not the sole focus, they were asserting their right to self-determination. They faced criticism, ridicule, and genuine obstacles, but they paved the way for future generations of women to have more choices. The uproar they caused, the cartoons that lampooned them, the sermons that condemned them, all of it seen from a distance, highlights the absurdity of trying to keep women confined to a narrow, predefined box. They were not just single, they were single-handedly, or collectively, rewriting the rules, and the sound of old norms shattering often came with a rather entertaining commotion.